I would like to start with a couple of remarks. First of all of you who couldn't come to other sessions of this conference and are hoping for a quick 45 minutes summary of what happened during the entire day today, you are going to be a little bit disappointed, right? So that's something which we are not going to do in this panel. This is not going to be a rehashing of all the conversations we had already, but really an effort to open several new perspectives in our thinking about the future of Europe. Now, before we start, I would really like to say two very short things. First of all, I would like to thank people who mentioned Stanley Hoffman today. Indeed, you know, this has been a great loss for the Center for European Studies and for many friends he had and students around the world. I think that Stanley's spirit is with us when we discuss important things about Europe. And I think that another legacy which we really need to emphasize is that Center for European Studies is a very collegial and very friendly place. And those of you who come often can really feel that this is a big part of Stanley's legacy, that we have this wonderful, friendly institution. Now, the second thing I would like to emphasize, and I would like to thank Ricardo Hausmann and Mr. Morbihan, that you know, we talk about crisis all the time. We started in 2009, and every big conference, big session is about crisis. But we really need to remember that this is a miracle what happened over the last 40 years in Europe. This is amazing experiment. This is amazing achievement. It goes through the rough patch at the present, but we should not lose that, you know, when we discuss all the problems, all the issues, and so on. You know, Orwell once said that things from inside look much worse. And I think we needed an economist working on Latin America to remind us that the European Union and Europe is such a great achievement. Now, the famous baseball player Yogi Berra just passed away yesterday, and he's known for inventing a number of quips which has been repeated over and over again. And I think for this session we are going to talk about future of Europe, and one of his quips is very appropriate here. So once Yogi Berra said, "It is hard to make predictions, especially about the future." Right, so that will be the guiding principle of this panel. We have two colleagues who are very well qualified for different reasons to offer us a new perspective. So Vuk Jeremić already has been introduced here. He is the president of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development. And Vuk's experience is very special because he comes from the Balkans. So he comes from that sort of gray zone of Europe we talk about, but he also had this illustrious career in the international institutions, being the president of the 67th session of the United Nations, and of course Minister of Foreign Affairs of Serbia. My colleague Niall Ferguson is professor of history at Harvard University and senior fellow at Hoover Institution and senior research fellow at Jesus College at Oxford, and has been one of the most influential public intellectuals of the last couple of decades. You have his bio. I'm not going to list all the great books he has written over the last couple of decades, but I wanted to mention the last one, the gigantic first half of the biography of Henry Kissinger, which already makes big waves, and everyone is asking when is the second part coming up? This is the curse of academics. The moment something is up and published, we are asked, so what's your next research project?
Difficult to make predictions, especially about the future.
Okay, let me start with the question to both of you. And the question is very general. We've been, for the last 8 years, talking about crisis, and this conversation comes in different configurations. So one day Greece is on the first page, the next day Euro crisis is on the first page, the following day, sanctions against Russia are on the first place, some, strange right-wing movements emerging in Europe. Of course, we have gigantic refugee disaster unfolding in front of our eyes at this present moment. And this raises, not only controversies in Europe, it not only shows paralysis of some European institutions or inefficiency of some European institutions, but also it shows division and really raises the question about the future of Europe. So are we at the moment that European project, the way we knew it, is falling apart? Is this what's going to happen, and refugee crisis is the last straw which breaks the camel back, and we are not going to see Europe the way we thought about we see it 10, 20 years ago? Neil.
Well, thank you, Grzegorz, for the nice introduction, and also for reminding us again about our loss with the death of Stanley Hoffmann. I think if Stanley had still been alive, my book would probably have killed him. So maybe as well that he didn't live to see a book about Henry Kissinger with the subtitle "The Idealist." One of the stranger chapters, incidentally, in the history of Henry Kissinger is the chapter that details his relationship with colleagues, relationships that turned extremely sour in the 1970s, but which had been extremely close in the 1960s, and the correspondence between him and Stanley Hoffmann was affectionate and friendly in the 60s. The reviews that Hoffmann later wrote of Kissinger's memoirs are some of the nastiest things the New York Review of Books has published. So let me try to answer your question with that generation of scholars in mind. That generation, and Kissinger, who's 92 now, can remember it, lived through vastly greater crises than any that are under discussion today. The population displacements associated with World War II were in the tens of millions. In the aftermath of the defeat of Nazi Germany, somewhere between 6 and 7 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe and the parts of Germany that were annexed and poured into West Germany. So even if 1 million people arrive in the Federal Republic in the course of 2015, which is not beyond the bounds of possibility, it is still a less dramatic upheaval than the mid-20th century saw. And one could say the same about the economic crisis that we have witnessed in Europe. True, some countries experienced Great Depression levels of unemployment, notably Greece. But if one looks at the Eurozone as a whole, or even the European Union as a whole, the impact has been far less than the Great Depression. Indeed, for the core economy of Europe, Germany, the differences between night and day. Germany in the 1930s has as severe a depression as the United States, with unemployment rates by some measures up to 1 in 3 of the workforce. Well, in practice, Germany suffered a mild slowdown in the course of the last few years. It's been the periphery of the relatively smaller economies that have been pounded. So we need to keep a sense of perspective before we proclaim the end of Europe. I wish I had a euro for every article I've read with the headline, "The End of Europe." I've written some of them, so I deserve at least a few euros. I've noticed that no matter what you write in an op-ed, someone will always give it the headline, "The End of Europe," unless you're really vigilant. I was constantly amazed at how often during 2012 particularly, eminent economists predicted the end of the euro. I think Paul Krugman predicted the collapse of the euro 22 times in the New York Times. And I'm still waiting for that prediction to be fulfilled. I bet somebody quite a substantial sum that the Eurozone would have more members this year than in 2010, and I'm going to win that bet when I collect at the end of the year. So I think one has to be extremely careful, and history helps you with this, in engaging the magnitude of a crisis. The modern media exist to tell you things are unprecedented. It's a very popular word with journalists, especially when applied to things that have happened before. And so whenever I hear the word unprecedented on the BBC or CNN, I always think about all the precedents that they have conveniently omitted. The vast Völkerwanderungen of the 20th century alone make what we're seeing right now in Europe seem still manageable. It's a huge crisis in the Near East, that's clear, but I'm not convinced that it's the apocalypse for Europe. Let me offer a couple more thoughts, and then I'll hand over to Vuk. Having written a biography of Kissinger, or at least half of it, I have been struck by a relatively simple but important insight. The world of the Cold War was a much more violent world than the world to which we've grown accustomed. Just to give you an example, if you estimate battlefield deaths for the 1970s worldwide, the figures of the order of 2 million. There were a lot of wars going on around the world in a lot of places, and they were fought with really quite destructive conventional weapons. Vietnam was only one. In the 2000 to 2009 decade, total battlefield casualties were about an order of magnitude less. It was about 250,000 worldwide. And what that tells us is something that ought to be obvious, but we've forgotten it. The end of the Cold War signified, amongst many other things, some of which were discussed at lunch today, it signified a dramatic reduction in conflict worldwide. Not only actual conflict, but also the possibility of nuclear conflict. I'm old enough to have grown up under that imagined mushroom cloud, listening to the Jams, A-bomb in Wardour Street. And with 1991, really that threat disappeared. We had a good 20-year period, which I'm going to call the short peace. John Gaddis, my good friend at Yale, called the Cold War the long peace. And I pointed out before that it was anything but that if you lived anywhere outside the most developed countries. It was the Third World's War in a great many countries. But the period after the Cold War was very peaceful. And we got used to that. In particular, in Europe, we got used to being able to have very small defense establishments that we hardly ever used. And this demilitarization, which Jim Sheehan's written about, is really one of the most important unnoticed things about our time. Europeans used to do a lot of war. Since the end of the Cold War, the continent has become a kind of hippie commune of implicit, if not explicit, pacifists, with some notable exceptions in the Balkans. And what I think we are seeing now is the end of the short peace. It ended actually in about 2011. I mean, it really ends with what was called quite erroneously at the time the Arab Spring. And that escalating violence that we have seen in what I'll call broadly the Middle East and North Africa was bound ultimately to have repercussions for Europe. And finally, they have arrived. But the short peace actually ended with the Tunisian Revolution and all that followed from it, particularly the Syrian Civil War. So I think we're now contending with a return to historical normality, and historical normality has much higher levels of conflict and population displacement than Europeans have got used to. And so it's a reality check. Europeans have got to do two things pretty urgently. One, they have to get serious about the questions of state failure in the near neighborhood. We cannot possibly sit and watch more states fail the way Syria has failed. And secondly, and I'll say more about this in the discussion, Europeans have got to get much more serious about integrating foreign-born workers into their workforces. Because if there is one thing that Germans and Scandinavians should be extremely worried about right now, it is their lousy record of absorbing foreign-born workers into the workforce. Fact, the OECD published data on this just the other day. The unemployment rate for a foreign-born worker, is 74% higher than for native-born workers in Germany. In Sweden, it's roughly 2.5 times higher. So there is a massive failure of economic integration, and it predates this new wave of asylum seekers and refugees. There are no such differentials in the United States. The differential is very much smaller in the United Kingdom. This is a problem of continental Europe, and until that economic problem is addressed, this wave of refugees will not have good economic, social, or, I'm afraid, cultural consequences for the recipient countries.
Okay, Vuk, how this looks from where you are in Europe, do you share the view that this is not such a fundamental back-breaking crisis of the European project, but the bump along the way?
Well, thank you, Grzegorz, and it's an exceptional privilege to be able to address this audience, and also to add to yours and Niall's tribute to Stanley Hoffmann. The first time that I had a privilege of meeting with him was actually in this room down the hall when Zoran Đinđić, the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Serbia, was visiting Harvard, and Stanley had a very long discussion with the Prime Minister. I used to be working for the Prime Minister at a time, and ever since we've stayed in touch, and he was one of the important figures in building up of my first of all student days at Harvard, and then some of the things that I did in the aftermath. Coming from the Balkans, coming from this not ideally pacifist part of Europe, and in the near past, I can say first and foremost that news from the Balkans are relatively good, and although Balkans is at the center of the stage when it comes to this migrant crisis, this refugee crisis, and especially Serbia, where about a couple of hundred of thousands of refugees from the Middle East are now strangled between the place where they're escaping from and the place where they're aspiring to go. Well, that thing aside, I think Balkans has been doing exceptionally well on a historical scale in the last few years, and much of it is to be credited to the aspiration to join Europe, to become part of this great European project. Admittedly, this prospect has become a little fuzzy in the last few years as a result of what was going on in Europe. We'll see how that plays out. But taking off my Balkan hat and trying to look at the situation from the outside, I do think it's a non-insignificant crisis that we're facing. I don't think that it started in 2009. I think it started really in 2005 with a great failure of European elites' attempt at coming to a constitution of Europe, which showed the break between the elites and the sentiment of the population, or at least parts of the population in some of the most important countries of the European Union. Well, it was really compounded with economic crisis, but right now we're seriously considering sustainability of the current financial and economic system in Europe, and especially when it comes to the Eurozone. And last night we had a privilege to listen to somebody who's far more knowledgeable than I am when it comes to the dangers looming over the European Monetary Union. But it's a little difficult to imagine a situation going in a good direction without creating more of, let's say, fiscal union, or at least a common European budget that would provide for a fact that there are parts of the European Union that are functioning in a particular way or as exporters, and there are parts of it who are finding it a little bit more difficult to cope with the measures that are dictated by those who are in a powerful economic situation. I think it opens up the question of the internal composition of Europe. How is it fundamentally going to be structured in the coming years? I don't believe that what we have right now at the table, which is the Lisbon Treaty, is going to be subject to no amendments in the coming years. And there are some external, well, not external, internal shocks, but coming from the outside of this particular debate, in particular in the context of the British debate on what the future for Britain in the European Union is. But I think that this combination of economic and political difficulties are having an effect of a negative feedback. And we see more and more anti-systemic, de facto anti-European political forces rising. I don't think it's a dramatic danger. I don't think that the next president of France is going to be Madame Le Pen, and I don't think that we're going to have a Podemos government in Spain towards the end of this year. But I think that it's going to be increasingly difficult for the mainstream European political forces to work in the direction of amending some of those mistakes that were made in the past. But I would really emphasize current European weakness and inability to act as a decisive player on the international scene as a result of these internal weaknesses, even when it comes to those international theaters that most directly affect its stability and existence. And of course, the most dramatic example is what's currently going on in the Middle East and in Syria in particular. We are going to have tomorrow the European Summit, and there's a good chance that the Europeans are going to come to an agreement on how to distribute a certain number of refugees between the member states. But that's certainly not addressing the cause of why all these people are coming to the European shores. It's about what's going on in Syria. It's about what's going on in the Middle East. It's about whether or not we're going to put to a stop this ongoing tragedy. And I don't see the European ability to act as a leading force in the international debate on how to resolve this issue. America is definitely a player there. Right now, a lot of people see it as a reluctant actor when it comes to this particular theater. Russia is definitely becoming more and more of an actor in this discussion. We see America saying in the last few days that there has to be an engagement with Russia with regard to what's going to keep going on in Syria. But I don't see the European activism with regard to this crucial theater that obviously influences what's going on in Europe to the point of what one can call a political crisis. Now, some European countries do have an important role to play in certain international theaters. France is a very important player in parts of Africa. The United Kingdom is working very closely with the U.S. in a number of theaters of significance. But I don't see the coherent, strong, and decisive European foreign policy. So in that sense, I'm a little bit skeptical with regard to what's going on right now because I don't see positive developments. Last thing that I'm going to say, I am not a historian. I'm not as knowledgeable as Niall. This might be a blip, and this, if one looks at it from a wider perspective, this might not be as dramatic. But as somebody who has been in politics, I don't have a totally calm feeling with regard to what's currently going on.
There was this old saying in Brussels that European Union is like a bicycle. The moment you move ahead, everything is all right. The moment you stop, you fall. Now, I would like to ask you about, push you a little bit about the direction Europe is going to move. Many people today express the opinion that enlargement of the European Union over the last 20 years or so, or 15, has been the biggest achievement of the Union so far. That it brought prosperity and security to millions of people living on the peripheries of the Union and changed the economic landscape in Europe in a very fundamental way. Now, are we thinking about more enlargements? Is this feasible that the Union will enlarge in the coming year? Are the Balkans going to join, or we'll get the 2050 date for the membership?
Well, this is a very, I'd say, a special moment in the recent history of Serbia. We have now a parliament that is composed of parties, none of which are anti-European. Every single party that is present in the Serbian parliament, unlike some countries of European Union proper, we're all very strongly pro-Europe. We are prioritizing European accession. But, the last time that we had a European Commission, under Barroso, we had a Commissioner for Enlargement. And we no longer have an Enlargement Commissioner. In Juncker's Commission, there is no Enlargement Commissioner. There is a Commissioner for enlargement negotiations and neighborhood policy. So I think that these mixed signals that are sent out of Europe with regard to enlargement, and I'm not talking about the Balkans, is something truly suboptimal. Voids and vacua, they don't tend to last in international affairs. And right now, Balkans is going in the right direction. I'd be worried about maintaining this course of direction if there is an ongoing a lack of appetite in Europe, which we're facing right now with regard to the accession. Mixed signals with regard to accession could bring about disastrous effects. And one example of this is Turkey, obviously, where this mixed signaling of whether Turkey has or has not place in Europe has brought about a situation in which Turkey is no longer thinking about its European future, and the rest was history. We can debate Turkey for a long time. And another place where it has led to a very, very difficult situation is Ukraine, where we don't really know. I don't really know if there is any hope for Ukraine to join the European Union. Yet it is on the forefront. Yet it is a key borderland and through the territory of Ukraine, you have the refraction of possibly one of the most delicate, crucial, potentially destructive relationships that Europe has in the 21st century, and that is the relationship with Russia.
Let me offer a slightly different perspective. Europe is going to be enlarged one way or the other. It can either be enlarged by expanding its official membership, or it can be enlarged by a vast influx of people from unstable states on its periphery. I don't know if you've been following this closely, as I've been trying to, but it's not the case that everybody pouring into Germany right now is from Syria, though you might make the mistake of thinking that if you only watch TV news. Actually, since January down to August, according to the official data on applications for asylum, 23% of those in Germany now came from Syria, 16% from Albania, 13% from Kosovo, and 5.7% from Serbia. Now, this is their Herkunftsländer. I mean, it's a little bit hard to be sure quite where these people came from in terms of nationality, because, as you all know, this is a highly confused and confusing issue under the asylum law. But I think it is an important point to emphasize that the mass migration we're witnessing right now is not just it's not just a Syrian story. It is partly a Balkan story, but there are also people coming from Eritrea, from Pakistan, from Nigeria, and from other African countries. Afghanistan is a major source too. So my sense is that Europe's going to be enlarged. It can be enlarged in this way, or it can be enlarged in a way that would be more orderly and more constructive. Is it going to be enlarged in the latter way? No, it is not, because while populist movements in southern Europe, like Podemos, which Vuk mentioned, are clearly past their peak, you ain't seen nothing yet in northern Europe. Because the one thing that I can tell you with absolute 100% confidence is that the refugee crisis is going to boost support for the anti-immigrant parties of northern Europe. The only place that this will really be restrained will be Germany, because it's still a toxic thing to be seen to be to the right of the CSU. But the CSU has broken ranks so spectacularly with Chancellor Merkel that they seem almost to have entered a coalition with Viktor Orban in Hungary. These trends will be more visible in Scandinavia. It's already there very visibly, for example, in Sweden. Watch the Netherlands. It's a really extraordinary shock, and I think it happened just when it seemed like the populists were going to fade, because ultimately their attack on Europe had not quite come off in the wake of the crisis. But now they're on much more safe ground, because really what motivates populists is not attacks on the EU bureaucracy, it's attacks on immigrants, and particularly on the phenomenon of Muslim immigration. And notice a huge proportion of the immigrants are Muslims, and one cannot simply pretend that that is not the case, and nor can one pretend that it is not a major concern of voters, not least in France. I don't agree with you, Vuk. I think Marine Le Pen, for the first time, is a credible contender for the presidency. I never thought I'd say that, because I always that there would be, in a second round, a coalition of centre-left and centre-right to beat her. I think anything is now possible, and we should beware of the magnitude of the populist backlash in Northern Europe. What does this imply? Well, apart from many more articles entitled "The End of Europe," what it actually implies is the end of a vision of Europe that I would say has the date stamp 1989. It's the end of a vision of Europe that could simultaneously offer ever closer union and enlargement. It's the end of a vision of Europe that imagined a viable single currency for multiple nation states without a single common fiscal policy. That never was going to work. Some of us said at the time it wouldn't work. All that we said would happen has now happened. Can we please now get real? Some of us also said Schengen wouldn't work. You know, people have been saying these things won't work in Britain for a rather long time, and that's why Britain did not join the single currency and did not join Schengen. The real issue we should be debating in Europe today is not will or will not Britain remain in the EU. I think when it comes to a referendum, whatever the opinion polls say in the weeks leading up to it, they will vote to stay in. The real issue is, can the rest of Europe adopt the same relationship to the EU that Britain already has? That is to say, recognize that we overreached in the 80s and 90s. We really overreached. And that there are certain things that Europe's nation states can't credibly pull. I think a Europe that can enlarge in a stable way is a Europe of multiple currencies and real borders. In other words, the Europe that Britain currently belongs to. If one could evolve institutionally to the point that everybody was a signatory of Maastricht on the British basis, then I think the EU would become stable again. But that means abandoning a utopian vision of ever closer, ever larger union that we always thought, rightly, would fail.
We talk about refugee crisis for the entire day. Let me ask the question, which is the following, right? You know, a lot of people, I sense that, has some sense of satisfaction watching Europe today. And they say, all right, you got what you deserve with your high, you know, human rights values and all other things. Now you are in trouble, and many places were in similar troubles before. But the question is really, is the refugee crisis affecting Europe a European crisis, or is it a global crisis? How different parts of the world should react to it? Should different countries in the world participate? Should UN be involved, big deal, in trying to solve this? Or everything should be left to Brussels and a bunch of European leaders? Book.
Well, I think that what we're currently facing in Europe through a refugee crisis is certainly going to have global implications, and Europe is not the only part of the world where these things have been happening. Recently, we spent some time over the last couple of days talking about the boat people and the refugee crisis in Asia and some other parts of the world. But just talking about what's currently at the table, I think that there was a mistake in the past on behalf of Europe for substituting foreign policy with simple enlargement policy, and it was a very superficial way to substitute the common foreign policy, and it obviously didn't work, or it has come to a difficulty right now. I think that some of the people in Europe, some of the leaders in Europe, are making the same mistake now, trying to substitute foreign policy with migration policy, with the successful resolving of the refugee situation. I personally believe that this crisis is not going to go away until there is a very serious addressing of the source. Addressing of the source of the crisis, and I don't only mean Syria, but Syria is obviously the epicenter. The current situation in Syria, the current level of devastation that we have in Syria, even if the war stops tomorrow, and it's not very likely that it's going to stop tomorrow, I mean, that is a scorched earth. And for the next 10 years, there are going to be, no real economic conditions for generations to prosper. So I think that they're going to, keep coming, even if we start decisively acting now. So I believe that that's something that must be considered by the European leaders, and that cannot be done by Europe alone. The successful addressing of the Syrian crisis obviously cannot be done only by the European forces. It has to involve other actors. It has to be a harmonized process in action, if need be, that involves the United Nations, that involves the Security Council, that involves the United States and the Russians, who also happen to have an important voice on the Security Council. So I believe that Europe should lead the way in addressing this issue. It's not really on the item list for the leaders that are going to meet in Brussels tomorrow, and I find it a little depressing that it's not being addressed, because you can't just deal with the consequences, deal with the symptoms. You really must address the source, and not in a way that was obviously done or mismanaged in Libya. Libya is an example of how things can go disastrously wrong if they're not seen through or followed up. That kind of action with a serious vision of what will unfold with European help and international help in the Near East, Syria in particular, has to be part of the solution. And I believe that Europe, more than anybody, has a reason to lead the way. Right now, I don't see this coming, but I hope things may change in the coming months.
There's been a refugee crisis for years. It's just that Europeans chose to ignore it because it didn't directly impact them. If you've been following the UNHCR's reports on this subject, the worldwide scale of displacement is now approaching post-World War II levels, at least in absolute numbers. It runs into the tens of millions, and it is not just confined to the neighbors of Syria. I mean, there are hugely displaced populations in Central Africa and in other countries that are subject to disruption and politically weak institutions, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so on. That's why people are coming from all over. State failure is a major problem of our time, and part of the difficulty we have is that we discredited, at least in our own eyes and perhaps in the eyes of the world, the notion of state building in Iraq. So that when one thinks back, the long way back to 2001 and what followed from it, the pendulum swung first all the way to a both liberal and neoconservative vision of forcible state building, democratization, and all the rest of it in Iraq and Afghanistan, to the other extreme. We can't do anything anywhere ever, which is kind of where we ended up. And that attitude produced Syria. The we can't do anything anywhere attitude has a very poor track record in history, actually a worse track record than the record of trying to do things. And that's therefore not surprisingly led to the result that more people have lost lives now, almost certainly, as a result of non-intervention in Syria than lost lives as a result of intervention in Iraq. So we have to sort of find some realistic middle ground. By we, I mean not Europeans alone and not Americans alone. Global problems require solutions that are not unilateral. And we need to work out what American leadership is going to look like in the coming years. It's been absent, conspicuously absent, for painfully long. And I think the challenge, and this is again inspired by looking back at the era of the Cold War, is how to reconfigure it in ways that deal with problems of the sort that produce displacement. I entirely agree with Fook. Mass displacement of people in their millions is a consequence. It's a consequence of something else. It's a symptom of state failure. And until there is more effective leadership from the West, and by the West I mean North America and Europe, this kind of state failure is going to continue. In fact, I could give you a list of countries that are likely to fail if we do not change our course in the next 10 years. And as they fail, the number of displaced people will continue to increase. I think we have to come to our senses, and this applies as much to the United States as to Europe, and get over the extremes in which we found ourselves since 2001. End this pendulum swinging, which incidentally is not a new phenomenon in American history, and try to aim at interventions that are effective in preventing state collapse. You would have thought that from Somalia we would have realized that it's quite a bad idea to let states collapse. But no, we're in the state collapse business. And as the geographies of the mid-20th century unravel, don't be surprised if more states collapse. And we may look back and say, gee, we thought it was pretty bad in 2015. But in fact, it got a lot worse because we didn't understand what process was going on. By the way, I'm very struck when I follow the European media, which I do, by the extent to which the refugee crisis is represented as if it were the result of a natural disaster. Remarkably few commentators appear willing to own the fact that a huge mistake was made in handling the aftermath of the so-called Arab Spring. And it wasn't just a mistake by President Obama. It was a mistake by European leaders too. Don't want to flatter Thierry too much, since one never wants to hand plaudits. One doesn't want to hand plaudits to the French too frequently. But one does hear admiring things said by British and American military experts these days about the French intervention in Mali, which is a reminder that with the targeted and effective application of force, it is possible to prevent state collapse and defeat Islamists. We should think more about the lessons of that operation. It may turn out to be an example of what we should be doing a lot more of to prevent further state failure in the future. So we need to get back to doing these difficult things that we thought were all George Bush's fault and we'd never have to do again. We really need to grow up and start understanding the recent history of the European and American foreign policy debate if we're to move forward and prevent further state failure.
So do you think really that the main challenges facing Europe, we discussed for the last 20 years, rise of China, the US pivoting to Asia or being disengaged from Europe, are those old challenges still in place, or we are sort of, adding a new issues about Middle East and so on, or the collection of those challenges somehow change with, crisis developing in China, or, Russia is not as aggressive, probably, and ready to do mischief as it was a year or two ago.
I think there are three major challenges that the United States and the European Union currently face. One I've alluded to, which is the extent to which radical or extremist Islam can exploit state failure in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. That is a huge challenge. If you look at the data on armed conflict and on terrorism, the growth is exponential, and it's nearly all associated with Islamist groups in the case of terrorism and majority Muslim countries in crisis in the case of armed conflict. That is challenge number one, and that's ultimately what lies behind much of the refugee crisis. The second challenge is not the rise of China. Put simply, I think the challenge is more likely to come from malfunctions in China's rise, malfunctions that then lead to unexpected and potentially destabilizing moves by a regime that cannot solely rely on economic growth to legitimize itself. Watch very closely. I think it will be fascinating to see what President Xi says on his American trip. He's had a pretty bad summer, and things are looking a lot worse for the Chinese economy than the majority of analysts would have said a year ago. This has its implications, and the Chinese geopolitical strategy since Xi took over has been more assertive in a variety of different ways, particularly financial and naval assertiveness, and I think there is more of this to come. The third challenge is the least of the three, but it's not a small one, and that is how Russia contends with the post-imperial blues. It's difficult coming to terms with the end of empire. Ask any West European, it takes time, and the Russians are still not over it. They are in a parlously weak economic state at this point and will remain that way with energy prices where they are, which they're likely to remain at as long as China's growth is this slow. But they have a hell of a lot of weaponry, and they have a distinctly dangerous political form of leadership. This curious synthesis of state monopoly, capitalism, and mafia, which makes the Russian state a danger not just to Europe, but a danger also to other regions. I mean, Eastern Europe tends to get all the attention, but you have to remember that Russia can play its games with Central Asia too, with the Caucasus too, and I think it's born of weakness. It's born of the post-imperial trauma, but it can make a lot of mischief. One thing Europeans ought to bear in mind, and it's something that our good friend Anne Applebaum talked about when she visited last semester, is just how much money the Russian government puts into far-right populism in EU states. Because it's no accident that so many of these rightist leaders say nice things about Putin. From Marine Le Pen to the odious Alex Salmond of the Scottish Nationalist Party, they're all kind of on the payroll indirectly or directly. This is a great way of subverting. This is a great way of subverting the West European project, and it's not the same as pointing a nuclear weapon at Washington, but it's still going to be a major problem, and we do not have it figured out. The subtlety and sophistication of Russian cyber warfare has got, I have this from high levels, has got people worried, and we don't have a good strategy for dealing with this new and pretty disruptive threat. If it's true that the Russians can close down, as I have been told, West European television stations, did you hear that, Thierry? Then their cyber capabilities are really potentially very much bigger than we probably are assuming. So these are the three things we need to worry about. Everything else is noise.
Right, Vuk, on the global challenges for Europe? One moment.
I would actually agree with Niall about the three things that one needs to look at, and I don't think that I have anything to add to what he had said about the radical Islam. This is something that definitely needs to be looked at, and we haven't mentioned ISIS throughout this discussion, but it is there. It's a big changer in terms of what we've had in the past, or the simplified views on the Sunni-Shia rivalry or the balance of power. ISIS is there, and I don't see for some reason, and we can debate this reason, I don't see an appetite on behalf of the international community led by the West to get rid of this threat. But I think it's a very, very complex question. Now, briefly going to the last point about Russia, we've seen over the past 2 years a real deterioration of relations between Russia and Europe and America. And again, it's a very long story, and one can talk about how did we go about to the point where we are. And I agree with Niall with a number of things that he says. But I mean, you're now writing, or you've written the first volume of Kissinger's biography, and back in those days, he looked at the globe and he saw Soviet Union as one great rising threat to United States and to the Western world, and then he decided to do something unexpected, and this is to go to another much smaller boogeyman, and drove a wedge between the two, between the People's Republic of China of Mao Zedong at the time and the Soviet Union. I'm just wondering if there is a real fear of what China is rising into, or mal-rising into, as you said. Maybe it's worth exploring a Kissingerian strategy of talking to someone who's not really your cup of tea, and trying to drive a wedge, because the current nearing of Russia and China, which is the effect of the European and American sanctions, the increasing energy cooperation and military cooperation between Russia and China, this is a strategic trend that I would not so easily discard and underestimate as a threat to the global stability of the 21st century. So maybe it's worth thinking in Kissingerian terms in this particular context. But going now to China and going to Europe and its role in this global order. A lot of people, for a very good reason, are talking about the 21st century being the Pacific century, in a way that 20th century was Atlantic century. That you're going to have two major players, the G2, whatever, and the United States and China are going to be the ones, the actors dominating international discourse and international economics of the 21st century. Well, if that happens, then by pure geography, Europe is going to remain a periphery. Europe is going to be in the back. And I think it wouldn't be a future. This is certainly not a future that I, as a European, would wish to live to see. Now, I think that Europe needs to strengthen its economic relationships with both China and the United States. I think that Europe really needs to invest a lot into the TTIP coming into existence. I think that the transatlantic relationship, the strengthening of the transatlantic relationship, I'm now talking in economic terms, in other terms as well, but economic terms first and foremost should be one of the European priorities. But at the same time, looking at the great initiatives, grand initiatives that are coming out of China, and we can spend probably hours talking about the sustainability of the Chinese growth and the seriousness that China has with regard to these new projects. But these new projects are out there. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is a reality. And the new Silk Road that was launched by the Chinese leadership a couple of years ago is a very, very serious project. Not without difficulties, not without obstacles. But I think if one really wants to think big, strengthening of European relationship with both China through the building of the new Silk Road and strengthening of the transatlantic relationship with America through the TTIP, in a way might have, let's say, have the effect of putting Europe back into the middle of the global flow. I think it's in European interest that the interaction between the two big players of the 21st century, America and China, goes through Europe and not leaves Europe out and make Pacific the one and only medium of interaction between the superpowers of the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. This panel was designed as a conversation between Niall and Vuk, and we started a little bit late, but I would like to test the temperature of the audience. I will accept several questions, and then we'll try to reflect on those questions in the end. But please introduce yourself and be as concise as possible, right? The questions, question mark. Please, sir.
I joined the Harvard faculty almost exactly 60 years ago as a temporary 5-year appointment, and I stayed ever since. It's a bad habit. I just wanted to point out, I've been thinking about these, certainly about nuclear weapons, since 1956, talking with the Russians. No, I think my first thing with the Russians was 1956. The point we mustn't forget is that since the end of the Cold War, Russia and America each have as many nuclear weapons as they had before, and in fact amount of material of high-grade plutonium ready for making nuclear bombs is slightly increased indeed. And that's enough to destroy civilization several times over. And we tend to forget that, and we mentioned once by Niall. So that's a very important point, and it must not get forgotten. And the other thing I wanted to mention, which I happened to find out and realize, I'm an immigrant, like many people, like most Americans, basically, in a country of immigrants. I came from England. In 1938, you can ask yourself the question, which of the European countries had a leader which was trusted by its own people? And the answer, unfortunately, is it was Germany, and Hitler was more trusted by his own people than any other European leader was trusted by his own people. And these are two facts which are simple ones and must influence, and one can't be too optimistic about the future with those two facts in the past.
Thank you very much.
May I briefly respond to Professor Wilson? It's an honor to have you here. One of the most impressive features of Harvard life in the 1950s and 1960s was the ability of economists, historians and physicists to sit down and discuss the problems posed by the nuclear arms race. And I think that community made a significant contribution to our understanding of what was the central problem of the Cold War era. It wasn't just luck that avoided Armageddon. Thought went into it too. And we do well to heed your words. It's not as if these weapons went away in any significant way. And of course, we currently live in an age of slow but steady nuclear proliferation. And indeed, the very fact that in 10 years' time Iran may be a legitimate nuclear-armed power is a reason why it's hard to be optimistic about the intervening period for the Middle East, because there's now a race on amongst the Sunni powers in the region to be ready for that eventuality. You can anticipate conventional conflict and increased levels of terrorism in the interim period, precisely because of the nature of the deal that's been struck with Iran. So I think the nuclear issue is in some ways a more complicated one in this time of proliferation. It was a relatively simple two-player game for a time, but we're far, far now from the simple prisoner's dilemma problem. The other issue that you raise, Professor Wilson, is that of fascism. I wish I could say that fascism was dead and gone. And unfortunately, it has a way of coming back, somewhat mutated, but still recognizable. What makes it so uneasy, at least makes me so uneasy, is to detect distinctly fascistic streaks in certain governments that like to present themselves as democratic. And that streak of fascism, with the 80%, 90% approval rating, with elections being won by staggering margins, 110% of the people in some cities voting for the party of the president. I mean, that we've seen that before, and we know that it doesn't bode well. So I'm very glad you raised both those issues. Sometimes one has the impression that European leaders, maybe because they spend too much time in Brussels at ECOFIN meetings worrying about Greek debt, have forgotten that the nuclear weapons are still out there and that fascism is still a force, at least in some not too distant countries.
Let me have a couple of more short comments or questions. Tony.
Anthony Jones, Centre for European Studies at Northeastern University. I was very interested in the way in which both of you touched in this last half an hour or so on external factors, because people seem to be obsessed in discussions with internal factors within the European Union. But I think, along with the two of you, from what I've heard, that the real challenge comes from the outside. And I think that the two things you picked on, which I think are especially important, is one, the neighborhood issues, the neighborhood to the south with the Mediterranean in complete disarray, with very little hope of solving their problems, still isolated from the global economy, and with very fast-growing population, but almost no economic growth. So I think Niall's perfectly right there. That's going to continue into the indefinite future. So to the east, of course, we have the things that you've discussed with Russia. So I think both of those are enough to keep even a healthy Europe fully occupied, and we're far from having that. But I'd like to hear a little more, if you could, on this issue of the transition from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Because this, I think, is something that I don't hear people in Europe talking about very much. We had Prime Minister Ayrol here not too long ago who wasn't at all interested in this issue. But I think that this really is a challenge. When we moved from Mediterranean to Atlantic, the Mediterranean became a backwater. Now that we're moving from the Atlantic to the Pacific, there's a real danger, as Vuk said earlier, of Europe heading in the same direction. If that's not to happen, what, in addition to increasing ties with USA and more ties with China, what can Europe do to prepare for this future which is coming, but the characteristics of which are yet still unknown?
This is a big question at the end of the day. I think let me close the floor, because I didn't see much enthusiasm and hundreds of hands up. Let me go back to Vuk and Niall for sort of final reflections and maybe response to Tony's question. Please.
Well, thanks for the question. I mean, this is just one thing which I said is, I believe, something that European countries must prioritize. But in order to be able to do that, Europe must function as a single bloc. It is difficult to work with giants if you're divided between yourselves. And the point in question is how you engage with China. China is now cooperating with Europe with the luxury of being able to have Europe a la carte, working with single European states, each of which is, too small to be able to be a significant equal partner, or let alone equal partner to China. There is this a concept of working only with East Europe 16+1 format, in which China engages only with the governments of Central, East, and Southeast Europe. Europe has to, appear as a bloc in those negotiations. So we're going back to the problem of how united Europe can be, and I agree that with what Niall said earlier about the everlasting union. It has run into difficulties perhaps earlier than most of the analysts would have expected. But in the end of the day, I don't see a great future of Europe as a major world player unless there is perhaps not an ever closer union, but like an ever more efficient and united union. Whether or not that implies closeness or not, I mean, we can probably debate it. But a practical thing that Europe must do in that sense is to be an active participant in the debate on the creating of the new world order. And I'm sure that Niall can speak much more to the point when it comes to that. He, having spent some time with Henry Kissinger, who had written the book on the New World Order, what it means and what kind of world we're going to have in our lifetime. But definitely the rules of the game are changing. And Europe must be a significant participant in the making of this order. be it rules, be it multilateral institutions and the new functioning of those multilateral institutions, security or economic institutions. But without being a player, it is going to become a backyard. And right now, most of the political energy that is being right now dissipated and used in Europe is to do with its internal struggles. If Europe turns into a fortress, then Europe is definitely going to end up as a backyard of the world in the 21st century. I hope I don't live to see that happen.
The Pacific Age is an attractive notion, and perhaps it was a symbol of this age when Xi Jinping's first stop was to meet with the titans of Silicon Valley on the West Coast before heading this way. Pope's itinerary was kind of more old school. Washington, New York, come on. So I think this is a really good question to end with. And one of the reasons that Kissinger's most recent book, World Order, is worth reading is that he addresses precisely this question. I noticed a passage today that's terribly prescient, in which he visualizes a kind of post-Westphalian Europe, preoccupied with its own navel gazing, sitting right next to a highly volatile Muslim Middle East, and, as he puts it, each impinging on the other. Well, boy, are they impinging on one another now. So I think it's right to conclude with some discussion of what that implies for Europe, because one thing's for sure, we can't relocate to the Pacific. The key point here is that the Atlantic is not where the Mediterranean was suddenly in the course of the 16th and 17th century. It's not for three reasons. The first is that there is still a major economic relationship that is not about to go away between the United States, indeed North America, and the EU. And the EU is a pretty big economy when you tot the GDP up. It may not be growing very fast, but it's still important. And it's hugely important in the international financial system as well as in the realm of trade. So that's point one. Point two is that NATO is still a real institution. We haven't mentioned it once, but as long as it's a real institution and as long as there is a meaningful threat, which well-informed people certainly think that there is, to EU members from an aggressive Russia, then the Atlantic still matters. And finally, I think it's important to emphasize that as post-Westphalian Europe is impinged upon by a volatile Middle East, the security threat that I mentioned earlier, represented by extremist Islam, is an Atlantic issue, because it crosses the Atlantic. It doesn't just cross the Mediterranean. It doesn't just go back and forth from Europe to Syria and from Syria to Europe. It has the potential to cross the Atlantic. And in that sense, I don't think the United States is going ultimately to pivot to the Pacific. Periodically, this fantasy crops up in American strategic discourse. It was one of the perennial, or rather regular, features of strategic debate during World War II, when the more enthusiastic American seamen would say, oh gosh, let's just put Japan first. And, Churchill and Alan Brooke had to keep reminding them that the war that mattered more was the European war, and in that sense that the Atlantic mattered more than the Pacific. I think that is still true. That is still true today, and the more problems we see in China, maybe the more true that will become. There, I've broken a lance for the Atlantic, a very Harvard-like sentiment to express. We study Europe here, and we've done it for a long time, with a particular perspective. And what made that perspective, I think, more than anything else, was a bunch of refugees who came here, refugees in most cases from Hitler in the 1930s. Came here with knowledge of Europe, but came here with an admiration for this country and the freedom that it offered them. Writing the biography of one of those refugees has been a fascinating insight into Harvard's uniquely, I think, important relationship of all American universities with Europe, and I hope very much that this conference is part of that tradition.
I hope that you share my views that this was very important and rewarding event. I would like to thank to all the speakers in all the panels.
One sentence before. Sorry, but sorry, Grzegorz. I just want to thank Niall. I want to thank you for this, and I just want to point your attention as you're leaving the room that you can pick up a journal that the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development is producing, a journal that is called Horizons, which has actually tried to address in some of the previous issues, including the last one, some topics that were debated today. Sorry for this abusing of the last moment in order to do a little bit of advertising.
No, that's great. That's great. But let me just sort of conclude my thanks, because a lot of people deserve thanks here. So I would like to thank again the staff of the Center for European Studies, and my thanks to a person who was not mentioned today, Damian Kraniewicz-Miszkowicz, who has contributed so much to this event. And most of all, I would like to thank our two last panelists, Niall Ferguson and Jeremić, for this wonderful exchange of ideas in the end of the conference. Thank you so much.